Into my background a little bit, but that's okay. That's okay. A little bit.
Welcome to this PA Political Digest podcast. I am your guide and host, Republican political consultant Christopher Nicholas. I am very pleased to be joined today by Chris Briem, who I know was a University of Pittsburgh professor and a demographics expert on Pennsylvania. Chris, welcome to the pod. Anything else we need to know about you before we start?
Good to be here. Thanks for having me. We'll probably get into it. I'm a lifelong Pittsburgher. Glad to talk about all things Pennsylvania to get out of our bubble here.
And I will note that we are recording this right in the middle of the big Flyers Penguins playoff hockey matchup, which as we speak today, the Flyers are up 1-0 in game. So that's good. Anyway, we're going to talk today about Pennsylvania's changing demographics. I always tell people, look, if you are bored with Pennsylvania politics, wait 6 months because it'll change. Okay. But I have described Pennsylvania for decades now in terms of its growth and demographic patterns as basically two places. And this is where we're going to start, Chris. I've said, look, the central PA, Lehigh Valley, Philadelphia suburbs triangle is booming and growing. And occasionally you get a little dot of that in the Poconos or in State College, because State College, we pump billions of dollars a year into that economy with Penn State University. But then the rest of the state is flatlining or declining. Is that something we're ever going to get past? What do you think?
Well, I mean, we probably need to back up a little more. I mean, this question is sort of like I get asked this question of give some comment on the Pennsylvania economy often, and if I get asked that question, I usually have a long diatribe. I'll be brief here. That there is no such thing. It's a fiction. The Pennsylvania economy. We are this artificial thing on a map called Pennsylvania is really a collection of some very disparate regions with very disparate histories, certainly different economic histories, but that economic history has also shaped this demographic trend. So you said two. I would certainly make that number much bigger, in terms of, how many regions within Pennsylvania and their individual sort of trajectories going forward. So, but as a starting point, absolutely. I mean, the stark differences between eastern and western Pennsylvania and even subregions within those areas really make it impossible to really, even though we're going to do it here, talk about Pennsylvania as a collective entity.
My old boss, inspector, used to talk about the fact that just how big and disparate Pennsylvania was, 6 media markets. He would say at least 10 regions of the state. I would remind him it was 45,500 square miles big. But, you're a lifelong Pittsburgher. I live in central Pennsylvania now and have for a long time, but I grew up in Bucks County in the Philadelphia suburbs. So to me, there's always been a great divide between what I refer to as East Coast Pennsylvania and Midwestern Pennsylvania. Okay. I think where I live and where I grew up is part and parcel of East Coast Pennsylvania. Where you are, Midwest, we don't have to go through the whole litany of, we say soda and you guys say pop, all that sort of stuff. But culturally, the voters there have always been more conservative. And about 15 years ago, they went from being conservative Democrats to now being more conservative Republicans. Your part of the world is just built differently. So does that prevent us from operating as one state, you think?
Well, I mean, what does it mean to operate as one state? What binds us together is sort of a bit of state level policy. And that's certainly important in limited senses. I would say it's actually not the driving force for most regional economies, even in that sense. So, I mean, Pittsburgh here, it's a fighting words whether we are Midwest or not. It's not that we're part of the Philadelphia East Coast agglomeration. It's more, are we our own thing, as the folks who were trying to define West Sylvania might have once tried to do. But, I actually coined, I didn't coin the term, but I take a bit of credit for people talking about this concept of Cleveburg. Pittsburgh and Cleveland have much more integration than anything between Pittsburgh and Philadelphia or Allentown or pick your region. Philadelphia obviously is a pull of the East Coast agglomeration that goes from Boston to DC, if not farther. And those two worlds are vastly different. And it's very hard. I do feel for our state legislators, you probably know them infinitely better than me, who craft any policy that applies to Pennsylvania, because in reality, the two contexts are so different and have been for so long that they have shaped what I think we're going to talk more about is the demographics of Pennsylvania, or these regions within Pennsylvania have been shaped by that difference.
What you said to me in an email is that in the is the population drained out of your part of the state because of de-industrialization, et cetera. And you said something I hadn't thought of before. You said all those people left, as did their children and future grandchildren. They're now dispersed someplace else. And what always hits me is my joke about Pittsburgh is it's hard to fit in there as a new person because everybody's still best friends with the kid they sat next to in second grade, right? You look at the Hispanic
Yep.
population, which is the only part of the state that's really growing, and very, very, very small percentage of Hispanics out in Western PA. Here in Eastern PA, it's a totally different story. So, do you think Western Pennsylvanians do they want to grow? Are they happy with where they are?
So this is almost a metaphysical comment, which I could take separately, or we could do as a different podcast. But yeah, I think it's baked into culture here in the U.S. that growth is good and growth is the metric of success. I actually argue against this as sort of a separate argument. There's a great book by someone named Alan Malik recently called "Shrinking Cities in a Growing World." I forget the exact title, but the reality is that most parts of the U.S., in fact, large parts of the world, will not be seeing growth in the future, and we need to redefine what is success. We can be a successful region without these top line population or employment growth numbers. This is well beyond your question. That's in my humble opinion, take on it. In reality, yes, most people, most politicians in particular, right? I mean, the opposite of this, if you let me drone on here for a minute, is this
Yep.
concept of managed decline, which is a concept that's been talked about and debated and pops up every now and then. And I think academically it makes a lot of sense to at least talk about. But I am fully aware that, any politician that sort of addresses or is a proponent of managed decline, even if it makes a lot of sense to do, and we certainly have a lot of communities where it made infinite sense to do, would be quickly run out of office. So I appreciate that. However, the reality of the world is a lot of places, fewer and fewer places will be experiencing growth, especially here in the US. I'll leave it there. I mean, these are big topics to your simple question.
We don't make TV ads that say, we're for managed decline. Oh, although that is in effect what we are. I mean, to me, one of the big stories in the last 10 or 15 years is that our two big metros, Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, have held their own and are seeing some growth. COVID kind of put a wiggle in that. We're still trying to figure out if that was permanent or not. I mean, Pittsburgh's over 300,000. Philly's over 1.5 million. To me, though, those have been metrics benchmarks in the past. But no one screams into the newspaper, Pittsburgh Metro is doing great because Cranberry Township is growing. It's all about, well, what about, you guys call it downtown. In Philly, it'd be Center City. We seem to be latched on to these really old language defining our success or growth.
And maybe I'll just expand on that. I mean, I'm not here to pitch a book. I do have a recent book looking at the economic change in Pittsburgh over the last really decades, 50, even 100 years. And I talk about this. And what you have to realize is that Western Pennsylvania, not just Pittsburgh, and in fact, some of the regions that we know well, right? The smaller mid-sized regions of Pennsylvania, Altoona and Johnstown and Erie, and maybe just over the border in Steubenville and Weirton, and we could probably name a dozen more places that suffered traumatic levels of economic decline, lost a lot of their younger workers at the time. It's not true anymore. People believe all these young people are fleeing. It's not true anymore. Hasn't been true for a while. However, in the early 80s, if you were a young 20 something worker, you saw your economic opportunities elsewhere and you left. And in reality, the older folks, as at least I am, are now we get stuck in the mud, didn't leave. And in reality, that contraction was already off the chart bad, but it was worse than it seemed. We just are living through that now. We're working through that demographic change now because, as I said, those folks took with them their families and their future families. So even though we have moved on pretty decisively in some areas from that industrial legacy past, the top line employment and population numbers are still baking in decline that from 40 years ago. So we might be doing quite well, but because we shove together some metrics that really are capturing the past as well as the present, we kind of lose that. That's a little bit of a wonkish answer we could dig into, but there's a lot going on here.
So my mom's stepfather, one of my grandfathers, they were original Levittowners. So he got a job at the U.S. Steel Fairless Works. He was a maintenance man on the 8 mill. And as the famous story goes, he walked into, the office of William Levitt, who was building Levittown. He showed them his U.S. Steel ID. and put $100 down and got his Levittown or 2-1 house. The way it grew up is if you lived in Blue Ridge, every street there started with B. So when you told someone what street you lived on, you knew what development they lived on. My mom was part of the original graduating class of Delhausen High School, which was built in Lower Bucks when they put up the steel mill. She helped name it the Tigers and picked out the color scheme, all that sort of stuff. And then many years later, the steel industry went into decline. My grandfather was still working there. He retired, then it started closing down. Bucks County, where the Phyllis Works was, I mean, it hit a blip, but it barely paused in its growth. Out your way, we're still, as you said, in the middle of this 40-year adjustment to the steel industry out there going away. Now, I will admit it's a bigger percentage of what your folks' economy was out there than it was in Bucks County. But it's always fascinated me that some parts of the state could fairly easily rebound from that, and other places, quite frankly, it scarred them, and here we are still talking about it all these years later.
So, one thing you give a Pennsylvania perspective, which is very important. This concept of the Rust Belt decline, the '80s era deindustrialization. Pittsburgh gets put west. I say Pittsburgh, but again, we're just the large metro area here. I think you can extend everything I say to many of the mid-sized regions of Western Pennsylvania. People put Pittsburgh in the same pot of decline as like a Cleveland or Detroit in terms of impacts of that period of deindustrialization. I make a pretty strong case, or argue, not maybe not here, that the scale of decline here far exceeded that of Detroit and Cleveland. Certainly in terms of job loss, literally almost as much, twice as much or more of structural job loss as compared to Cleveland or Detroit. And our loss was permanent. Those jobs never came back. Whereas if you look at industrial Detroit or industrial Cleveland, a lot of those jobs did come back after a while. Ours almost never did. And then the Eastern Pennsylvania example you give is embedded in again, this vast agglomeration of very diverse economies, giving things to shift into. So if you forget Pittsburgh for a moment and think of Johnstown or think of Altoona or Du Bois or whatever, it's much more difficult for these smaller regions to shift into something else because there isn't that industrial or economic diversity there to seed other things of growth. So yeah, I hear what you're saying about Eastern PA, but it's also true the textile industry of New England collapsed and did not suffer because it happened over a longer period of time. And again, there were other things that workers and businesses were able to evolve to. If you have conformed to one industry, as Pittsburgh did for a century, and it goes away, the trauma is much higher. But again, we're big enough to have that diversity and some shifts, not complete, but again, a lot of Pennsylvania cities and regions are still struggling.
I think it's great that Pittsburgh is a leader in robotics and the technology that accrues to that. It's just not as much punch to talk about and write about a robotics worker as it is about some guy packing his black lunchbox every morning, walking down the street and working in the mill. That's just been so romanticized, whether it's a steel mill, coal mine, a foundry, those types of things. And I just think, as I call it, greater non-urban southwestern Pennsylvania. So everything around Pittsburgh, but not Allegheny
That
County.
doesn't work as an acronym, but we'll go with it. I mean, we got to make that actually greater.
I use it politically to kind of taking everything from Johnstown over, but not including Allegheny County, because that's kind of a different thing. But those other counties, greater non-urban southwestern Pennsylvania, has had trouble getting out of second gear. We thought with a lot of this transition to natural gas that would change. It certainly helped it at least stay in place, but it doesn't seem like a lot of those counties have been able to get out of second gear in terms of population growth. But you're closer to it than I am. What's your thought, Chris?
Look, there again, the shift since the collapse of these legacy industries has been dramatic in many ways that aren't people haven't really cogitated on. I mean, the steel industry writ large in southwestern Pennsylvania stretched out far from the city center. They needed the rivers, and we glommed up all of the Monongahela River, and it stretches on the Ohio to Aliquippa and beyond into Ohio, the Ohio Valley, the Steel Valley in that sense. And as the economy has shifted, it was those distant jobs that suffered the most. And I think that is what leads to sort of your immediate observation here that, beyond the city of Pittsburgh has fared least well, because as bad as it was for the Pittsburgh region, within the region, those are the areas that suffered even more cataclysmal cataclysmic losses. And just to put a data point on that, Beaver County, just outside the city, it's, a few minutes drive. We peaked at about 18% as a region unemployment in 1982. Beaver County peaked over 28% unemployment in 1982, which is higher than most states hit during the Depression. And what's grown here of late, these new industries, whether it's eds and meds or finance, or if you want us to talk about the somewhat nascent but growing private sector technology jobs, all have a geography that is the complete opposite of that history. I mean, they are very much city centric, tied to the universities or similar, or downtown Pittsburgh. I'm going to wax poetic in a minute. I don't want to ramble on too much, but just I'll give you a factoid. The city of Pittsburgh, you quoted the population number. People think that is sort of a metric of decline for the city. We're a city of 600,000 people. Are now 300,000. Oh, it's declined by half. The number of jobs located in the city of Pittsburgh is higher than it's ever been. I mean, we were about 300,000 jobs located in the city of Pittsburgh in the mid 1950s, probably was a previous peak. We are well over that today. So we remain this job center, but people have suburbanized. You have the great example of Levittown. That is the story of population decline in the city of Pittsburgh. It is not a story of industrial steel decline. That's a regional or Western PA construct, not a city of Pittsburgh construct in reality.
So as we tape this, we're at the beginning of NFL draft week, and the NFL draft is in Pittsburgh this week. It was in Philadelphia a couple of years ago, and I know the Philly folks loved it. So I don't know if you're a football fan. I think every Yinzer is, of course, a Steelers fan, but is there any excitement going on out there with all the draft stuff and all of the attention the city's getting?
I think some folks have been preparing this for I don't even know how long. I mean, a lot of people coming to Pittsburgh, a lot of people excited by that, a lot of businesses sort of expecting a bump in business. I think my site selection folks are all sort of hoping that the hordes that are descending upon us will include folks that will be excited about future investment. We might have overreacted a little bit. I mean, again, I think we're going to evacuate much of the city before they get here. So they might come to an empty city because we're so afraid of what's going to happen. I don't know. It'll be fine. It'll be interesting. A lot of true Yinzers are just going to stay away just because of the traffic and other issues. But we've had our moment in the limelight before. I mean, I point out it's now ancient history. Years go by, but the G20 came to Pittsburgh in 2009, and that was international news on a scale. It may not seem as big as the NFL draft, but at least on an international scale, it was far larger. The leaders in the middle of the Great Recession, they all came to Pittsburgh and attempting to solve these world economic problems. And a lot of folks came to Pittsburgh and said great things. So I expect something similar to that. They're going to come to Pittsburgh. And if you believe this is an old smoky mill town, you will be shocked and surprised. You will not see the soot in the air. You won't see the other pollution, but you won't see the soot in the air. You'll see clean rivers. You'll see a lot of new development, and should be fun.
So we are in the middle of a lot of redistricting talk this year, which normally you would not say the year ending in six would be a big redistricting year. But a plethora, I'll use that word, of states are out there either in the middle of mid-decade redistricting or debating whether to do it or living with the onslaught. Virginia has tomorrow, I believe, a vote on that. Pennsylvania peaked, I believe, in 1900. We had 36 congressional districts, and we have lost them every single redistricting since then. I think in 1920, there wasn't a redistricting because a lot of the states were afraid of the switch from rural vote to the urban center, so they skipped that. But every other decade, so come 2030, when we do it again, as a reminder to folks, the year ending in zero is when we take the census. The year ending in one is when we do the redistricting and reapportionment. And then the year ending in two is when those new districts come online. So we're going to lose another congressional seat. We're going to go from 17, Chris, to 16. Let's speculate, because it's a podcast. Where is that seat going to come from, the one that we lose?
I think that we're about halfway through the decade. Some people sort of quibble with the census estimates, but they're pretty much more solid than some people give them credit for.
Agreed.
We know pretty much where the major economic population trends are going. And so, as you said, we're pretty locked in. I mean, things could change. COVID has sort of screwed up a lot of our metrics of of everything for the matter. So maybe some things could change. We're going to pretty locked in to lose at least that one seat, and most of that population loss is in Western Pennsylvania. So I can't speak to how the the map drawing. Redistricting folks will do it. My good friend Jonathan Service, everyone knows, has done a lot of work with Pennsylvania redistricting and now elsewhere. I mean, I think it was a challenge to get to where they were last time around, but it's hard. The bases, I know, generally speaking, they want to keep everyone in their seats. That gets harder and harder. And I think, what was the story of? You probably know the story better than me, of Senator Pecora. Was it a couple years ago? You know,
In the late 80s, and, they moved his seat, and there's a court battle, could they do that? And then in his peak, he switched parties, which gave control of the state senate to the Dems, I believe, for a little while.
skip the background. They redistricted him to the other side of the state. The whatever
Yep.
district number that was went from Western Pennsylvania to Eastern Pennsylvania. And my understanding, correct me, is they thought his party leaders thought that would get rid of him, and he just picked up and moved. Right? He said, I'm now representing a place 300 miles away from me, or whatever it was, and served out his term. I believe. I don't think he ever moved on. I don't think he got reelected. But
So no, he did not. So when you look at the map of Pennsylvania, the way it works is the state house districts start at 1 in Erie and wind their way up to 203 in Philadelphia. The state senate seats start at 1 in Philadelphia and wind their way up at the 50. And that was to prevent anyone from living in the same numbered House district as Senate district. That is not the case. There are people who live out your way in both the 46th state House seat and the 46th
okay.
state Senate seat. But, one of the things that would happen is it like where I'm from in Bucks County, all the seats are in the 140s, 140, 141, 142, 143. But then there's an 18 stuck in there, Chris. So that's a seat that was in Pittsburgh that got moved because in state level redistricting, we don't lose seats. We still have 203 in the House and 50 in the Senate, but they get moved around, what I call political chiropractic. And then there's the next district up is District 178. That came out of Philly. Okay. So what happened is all these seats in the 20s, 30s, and 40s in the state house in Pittsburgh got moved to other places because of the population that lost. So let's save that for a minute. But if Pennsylvania doesn't lose a congressional seat, remember every state gets one, and then we're in a fight against other seats, other states. And one of the reasons we have been losing congressional seats is because of the interstate highway system and the advances in air conditioning that made the Georgias and Arizonas of the world much easier to live in. So it's not so much that we have lost population, but our share of the country's population has gone down. And that's how congressional seats are. So I would agree with you that we're going to lose a seat somewhere between where I am and where you are. Okay. Now that will be ameliorated perhaps if someone resigns or retires or doesn't run again, right? So it's easier to kind of finagle the seats around if Congressman Smith, decides not to run again. But to me, more importantly, being a political consultant, the parts of Pennsylvania that are growing lean towards the Democrats, and the parts of Pennsylvania that lean towards Republicans are losing population. So right now, the congressional delegation, we won a couple upset victories the GOP did in 2024. So it's 9 R's and 8 D's in our 17-member population. Fred Keller was the odd man out in 2022. His seat in North Central PA got eliminated. So he went away. So that's my concern that next time it's going to be another Republican seat. On the state level, uh, the trend has been moving seats out of Philadelphia and Pittsburgh to that Lehigh Valley, Central PA, Philadelphia suburb triangle that's growing. And the last time in 2022, they avoided having to move a state Senate seat out of Pittsburgh again. Because, as you said, we had all that history. But I'm not sure they can do that for another census come 2030, 2031. Your thoughts?
some of that parsing I'll leave to you and others who sort of think at that level of where things are. I mean, obviously, it's a big state, just in my world, so, if the growth is so unbalanced as it has been geographically, you either have to, you have to do a lot of stretching. Let's put it that way. I mean, you have to contort those borders a bit more and more. It certainly would be easier to just take something out of the east or west. I think premise of trying to keep these districts looking like they did. I mean, If we did a zero-based redistricting, I think we would have something very different, right? But almost all these districts, as you probably know infinitely better than me, have this history, have incumbents, and all this that sort of you're trying to put the square peg into the round hole at the end of the day. I can't speak to what the map makers will come up with. That's a realm of inside baseball that few of us play.
So I want to take a minute now to publicize the newest version of my voter registration guidebook that I have put together over. If my
Yeah,
camera
it's
can focus on that.
yeah.
Since 2013. And in the back, I do something called miscellaneous. Uh, Everybody knows our top two cities are Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. Very few can figure out three, four, and five, right? Or six.
You can tell someone's age by what they pick as the third largest city in
Exactly.
Pennsylvania.
The third largest, by the way, I'll save four, five, and six for later, but number three is Allentown. But we have six media markets in the state, basically where people watch TV from. And the three western markets are Johnstown, Altoona, Pittsburgh, and Erie. Okay. And they have all three of them just in the last 3 years, since I did the last version of this voter registration guidebook, lost 0.5%. Doesn't sound like a lot, but in 3 years, that's voters, not people. Politicos, we deal with voters first. Demographers like you deal with people. And so when I look at where we're going to lose seats from, well, okay, we're not going to lose seats in central PA because our media market, Harrisburg, has gotten bigger, has a bigger share of state residents. If it's all from out your way, and I think that builds into this narrative that doesn't seem to ever go away, that Western PA is declining. And as you said, Pittsburgh has more jobs now than it ever before.
I lost the question there. I mean, I was referring to the city of Pittsburgh. So the concentration of jobs in the city of Pittsburgh are very different. The people still live in a dispersed way, but maybe I'll just address this the implied sort of comment on where we're going in the future, because there are folks who talk about growth. We talked about that a second ago. Look, Pittsburgh, the region, was the first large metropolitan area to experience what's called natural population decline, more deaths than births each year. That dates back 30 years now. It's entirely, mostly all a reflection of how much we lost that younger population. And in reality, that is going to continue into the future. That's kind of baked in, so in any meaningful planning horizon, yeah, there's no easy way. There was no easy way, if you asked this question a couple years ago, for there to be a growth path here. If you actually take the current dynamics, again, most regions of the country are experiencing population gain only because of international immigrants. We can just listen to the national news of where we think that's going for the next few years. Fertility rates are changing, family size is changing. And even what people miss entirely is that the rates of domestic migration in the U.S. have been on a pretty substantial decline over the last decade or two. So even the pool of folks that you could generate growth from, people moving from Pittsburgh to California or Cleveland to Philadelphia, whatever that domestic migration piece, those flows are much smaller than they were. Kind of an ongoing question as to why, but the pool of potential growth is much harder. So the environment to generate growth is a very difficult one here for us. And Pittsburgh, it's probably much better than a lot of the regions you just mentioned along the way. The things between us and Harrisburg, the vast Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania T is suffering all these issues and more.
The T for folks, we don't use that verbiage as much anymore. When I was coming up in this business as a kid in the 70s and 80s, that's all you heard about. But the T is basically across the top of the state and then down through the middle, primarily except for around Harrisburg, rural counties. Pennsylvania has 67 counties. I would say that you could classify 47, 48 of them as rural, depending on your, current definition of that term. But the rural population in Pennsylvania, while still there, is declining. As the one generation passes away, there's not up and comers next there. So you go through the Mifflin counties and the Juniata counties of the world, and at your way, the Fayette counties and the Armstrong counties. And you just wonder, who's going to be living there in 10 years.
And that's been a very long-standing story. Rural depopulation is a topic that long predates anything we've talked about here. And it's a reflection of many things that I don't think are changing. Technology is impacting agriculture. The need for the geography of agriculture is shifting. A lot of that's transportation, right? These former train towns along the way, don't need the infrastructure they did before. So it's these places have become bad places. I think in the future they need to. I'm kind of going to wax poetic here. I'll shut up here. Is that it's a different type of competition for future growth. These are all places that need to build a viability, a quality of life that attracts workers. We need transportation to connect them. The world that a lot of folks seem to remember long ago of the mill town with a lot of jobs, with a bunch of workers who lived in very close proximity, has been gone for a long time. And so we need a way to redefine how these types of regions compete to remain viable places in the future, to be successful places in the future. Again, this gets to my managed decline argument a bit that, a lot of these towns, cities, regions need to think differently about what it means to grow and change in the future. I'll shut up with that.
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of old steel towns and train towns, and I used to describe Pennsylvania as place where everyone's grandparents are from. My freshman year roommate at American University, he was from suburban Buffalo, but his grandparents lived in Renovo. So Renovo is in the very top of Clinton County. And in Clinton County, all the growth and population is in the southern end along Interstate 80. And then you go a long way through north of Lock Haven where there is nobody. And then you get to Renovo. And Renovo was populated because it's where the train folks in Altoona sent a lot of train cars to get fixed, and that was the basis of their economy. And back in the day, at least, I'm not sure if it's still true, well, Pennsylvania has a lot of rural areas. At one point, it had the highest rural population of any state in the country. Because in Texas, they had rural areas where no one lives. They have counties in Texas where the total population is 220 people, and not just one, but a handful. Here, you go over every hill and dale, and there's an old train town like Renovo or an old mill town. So, we have this heritage of rural population. And the concern is you just contract there, and there's a lot less in between Harrisburg and Pittsburgh or Pittsburgh and Erie. And so, you lose some of the variety of the state of Pennsylvania. But if there's an easy way to get people to move from populated areas to rural areas, I don't think we've figured it out yet, have we, Chris? You
Oh,
know,
well, yeah, I mean, the factoid you just quoted, I remember it. I mean, I think people don't realize, I mean, dairy agriculture was much more labor intensive than, say, free range grazing. So that's why we had this big rural population. Again, that's changing a lot. This is an interesting comment about how to get people to change. The COVID has changed things. Let's just be clear. Working from home has not freed people to like work. There are some people working in California and living in Pennsylvania or something like that. That's actually not what seems to be happening. I mean, people are moving away from the job centers, but they retain that connection. So the places that are growing a lot in this new working from home world are things that are more a hop, skip, and a jump. From New York City, the Hudson Valley is, booming. I think this explains a lot of sort of the expansion of parts of Pennsylvania that are really, in effect, not officially part of the New York City metro area or the DC, Baltimore metro areas, people who might need to maybe go to work a couple times a week or have some connectivity. So what hasn't happened here, and what we haven't had much of that in Western Pennsylvania as yet, but a lot of that really depends. You asked the question of how, and I don't have that magic answer, but it starts with travel and transit. I was just speaking to some folks in far suburban Pittsburgh, let's put it that way. They were very excited that we're getting a second train line out of Pittsburgh heading west. Now, that's not a lot compared to places, but I mean, if you have that type of connectivity, again, from Pittsburgh to Greensburg to Johnstown and points west, you could possibly rebuild that type of mega regional connectivity that makes these places viable. But one train a day, which we're at now, and it's a horribly timed train, doesn't support that. But a lot of the growth of, if not rural-ish, ex-urban, bordering rural areas in the U.S. are doing well in this working from home world, but they've got to have that connectivity that I think Pennsylvania, on our side of the state. I mean, again, Harrisburg to Philadelphia, you can get an electric train. I don't know how many trains there are from Harrisburg to
a lot,
Philadelphia every
a
day. A
lot.
lot, a
Yeah.
lot, more than we see in a week
Yeah,
or
yeah,
more.
yeah, so
Yeah.
and I know the folks up in NEPA, Northeast PA, NEPA, NEPA, as we call it, are thrilled that it looks like this long hoped for train connection between New York and Metro New York into
Yep.
the Poconos and Northeast PA is on track to actually get beyond the talking stage and actually because we have a great, railroad infrastructure in Pennsylvania. It is kind of the home of the modern railroad, so that's something to build on. So before we close up here, give us 30 seconds, the name of and what your new book's about, Chris.
Wow, I should have one right here in front of me. I'm not a good salesperson, but recent book out last month called Beyond Steel: Pittsburgh and the Economics of Transformation. It's kind of a long title, but it looks at our long history as an industrial region, not just the growth but the decline. Really, I address the question of why steel lasted so long in Pittsburgh and why that long decline, something that was well predicted by more academic folks, was kind of ignored. So there's a question of denial in there, and really the beginning of telling the story of how we have moved beyond that, as I would argue, fairly much more cataclysmic than even people think about. We do teach steel in grade school here about the Steelers and also the steel industry, but it's now so long ago that a lot of that is either misremembered or more mythos than real. So Beyond Steel, at Kent State University Press, available at all your local however you get books, certainly on Amazon, and your local bookseller, I'm sure, can order it. You in Harrisburg,
And
I'll give a pitch for the greatest bookstore in the East Coast, I think, is the Midtown Scholar in Harrisburg. If you haven't
yeah,
been there, please go visit the Midtown Scholar.
yeah. How many books have you written, Chris?
Oh, this is the first, and it took quite a while. Might have almost killed me. Might be the last, but I have a few more planned, so we'll go from there.
Well, then you have successfully scratched that itch. Okay, we'll go back to the trivia question. I told everyone, obviously, Philadelphia and Pittsburgh are the top two municipalities in the state. I told you Allentown was number three. So, Mr. Demographic expert with a new book out, tell me the fourth, fifth, and sixth largest municipalities in Pennsylvania. Again, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Allentown. What comes after that?
Oh, I usually stump people with the Allentown one because most people our age or older will say Erie, right, is the third largest city, and Allentown has beat them. I won't get the order right. What's in there? Scranton, Erie, Reading.
So, Reading is four,
Yeah,
three is five.
I'm doing great.
Okay. Bethlehem is 7, Scranton is 8. No one ever gets 6. The
Second, give
6th
me
just
again.
it's in the eastern part of the state, Chris, the 6th largest municipality in the state.
York. Was York gotten that big? I don't think so. Yeah, no, I'll stay stumped here.
It is Upper Darby Township,
All that
which is in Delaware County.
fiction. That's
People don't
fiction.
think
That's
of
fiction. That is fake news. Fake news. That's
So after Erie with 92,000 and change, you've got Upper Darby at 86,000, Bethlehem at 79,000 and change. So you did pretty good. You might have to write a second book to get all those things in order. We have been speaking with Chris Briem,
thanks.
University of Pittsburgh demographic expert, author of the new book Beyond Steel on Pennsylvania, what I call our changing demographic kaleidoscope. I hope you've enjoyed this edition of PA Political Digest. And Chris, thanks again, and have a good draft week out there in Pittsburgh. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.